We'll be back with another conversation from the Listening Project just before midnight. In a moment, PM. Start the countdown.
T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12,
50 years
11,
since an historic
10,
journey.
9. We have liftoff.
At 10:36 this morning, Apollo 8 went around the far side of the moon at just over 7,000 miles an hour.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit.
Spacecraft, the Apollo 8, is back, and what a remarkable trip and a remarkable conclusion to it.
Houston, you're looking good here, right down the center line.
Britain's first astronaut, Helen Sharman, presents Apollo 8 on BBC Radio 4. Tomorrow evening at 8.
This is BBC Radio 4, and at 5 o'clock it's time for PM, introduced today by Caroline Wyatt.
Theresa May returns to Westminster from the latest EU summit, ever hopeful.
My discussions with colleagues today have shown that further clarification and discussion following the Council's conclusions is, in fact, possible.
But as we'll hear, time and again, her European counterparts said the agreement would not be revisited.
I have no mandate to organise any further negotiations. We have to exclude any kind of reopening our negotiations on the withdrawal agreement.
What next for the PM? Is there a plan B forming? It was different a year ago, as Mark Mardell finds out in Brexit, a love story.
I think that the Lancaster House speech was probably the best speech I've heard the Prime Minister make. It was very well crafted and it was extremely well delivered.
It was fortunate at times that the television cameras didn't turn around the other way and capture some of the ambassadors sitting in the front row who sat on their hands for virtually the entire speech.
And as the Severn Bridge toll is scrapped, Gavin and Stacey co-creator Ruth Jones shares her memories.
I was filled with this overwhelming resentment that I had to pay to re-enter Wales. I do remember being told off once and my change being withheld by the toll man until I said a proper thank you.
With the BBC News throughout the hour, Zeb Soanes.
Theresa May has left the European Union summit in Brussels, insisting that Britain will have more discussions with the EU in coming days, as she seeks further assurances on her Brexit proposals, which might placate her backbenchers. She said she'd had a robust discussion with the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, who used a news conference to deny suggestions that he'd called her nebulous. Our correspondent Kevin Connolly reports from Brussels.
Theresa May started her day in Brussels by confronting the President of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, over accusations he'd called her negotiating style nebulous. He looked sheepish, but she accepted he'd been talking about the overall tone of the Brexit talks, not about her. Most reporting here has suggested that the EU is not inclined to offer Mrs May much help in her battles with her Eurosceptic critics at home, but she insisted she had secured some diplomatic gains aimed at getting her deal through Parliament, and was confident of securing more.
After Brexit, Britons will have to buy a permit costing £6.30 to visit EU countries. The European Commission says travellers from the UK won't need a visa, but will have to apply for electronic approval under the so-called EU Travel Information and Authorisation System. President Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, says the president knew it was wrong shortly before the US election to order the payment of hush money to two women who alleged affairs with him. In an interview with ABC News, Mr. Cohen, who's been sentenced to 3 years in jail, said Mr. Trump was very concerned the allegations would become public.
Nothing at the Trump Organization was ever done unless it was run through Mr. Trump. He directed me, as I said in my allocution, and I said as well in the plea, he directed me to make the payments. He directed me to become involved in these matters.
Mr. Trump has said he never directed his former attorney to break the law. A ceasefire between Yemeni government forces and Houthi rebels appears to be holding in the main port of Hodeidah. Aid workers hope to deliver supplies to millions of starving people caught up in conflict. Here's our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette.
Today there's relief and very rare hope for Yemen, an impoverished nation on the brink of collapse. For now, the firing has stopped around the vital Red Sea port of Hodeidah, the lifeline for the aid 2/3 of Yemenis need just to survive. This morning, the head of the UN in Yemen, Lise Grande, told the BBC it was the beginning of the end of a tragic and senseless war. The agreement reached in Stockholm marks the first significant breakthrough in 5 years of failed UN peace talks. But it is only one small step towards peace and is still very fragile.
Bin workers in Birmingham have voted overwhelmingly to take industrial action in a new row about pay. The Unite Union said members would initially not strike, but would work to rule from December the 29th. Facebook says that almost 7 million users may have had their private photos accessed by third-party applications. The social media firm says a bug that caused the breach has now been fixed and is working to delete images that were improperly accessed. Joe Miller reports.
For 12 days in September, almost 1,500 apps were able to gain unauthorised access to private photos in millions of users' Facebook accounts, including some images that had not been made available to their own friends. The social media site says it's working with 876 external companies who developed these apps to delete any images they may have gathered before the bug was fixed. Although it only affected a small percentage of Facebook's 2 billion users, this latest breach of private data further underlines the tech firm's problems with third-party apps.
Spain's public prosecutor has filed a tax fraud allegation against the Colombian singer Shakira. It's claimed she evaded more than £13 million in payments while living in Catalonia for 3 years.
Zeb, thank you. Theresa May is returning from Brussels, but she appears to have come back from the trip empty-handed, or certainly without the kind of cast-iron fresh legal guarantees that some had been hoping for on the issue of the backstop. This morning, the Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, described last night's meeting with Theresa May.
The European Union, and that was no surprise for Theresa May, made once again clear that we will not open the withdrawal agreement again. The backstop is an idea for a short period of time and not for the next decades. And I think it was necessary to say this clearly from the European Union so that the UK can trust us on this.
Well, at a brief press conference, Mrs May welcomed the official conclusions issued by the EU27. They committed Europe to trying to get a post-Brexit trade deal agreed quickly enough to avoid the need for a backstop to keep the Irish border open.
I've held a series of discussions with my fellow leaders on the Brexit deal, and I was crystal clear about the assurances which are needed on the backstop, having heard the views of MPs in the House of Commons. I reiterated that it is in the interests of the EU, as well as the UK, to get this over the line. A disorderly Brexit would be good for no one. The EU have published a series of conclusions. The EU made clear that it is their firm determination to work speedily on a future relationship or alternative arrangements which ensure no hard border by the 31st of December 2020, so that the backstop will not need to be triggered. If the backstop was ever triggered, it would apply only temporarily, and the EU would use its best endeavours to negotiate and conclude expeditiously a subsequent agreement that would replace the backstop. That the EU stands ready to embark on preparations so that negotiations on the future partnership can start as soon as possible. As formal conclusions, these commitments have legal status and therefore should be welcomed.
Well, one reporter from the Daily Mail wondered if the Prime Minister ever wished to give vent to frustration over all of this.
You look like you've had a trying week. What's been worse?
Has something happened this week, Jason?
Well, I've read reports.
Oh, you shouldn't believe everything you read in the newspapers.
What's been more difficult? Has it been the malcontents at home, or has it been the Euro bullies over here? And have you ever felt like just throwing your phone in the bin, moving to a remote island and letting someone else sort this mess out?
Look, I've throughout all of this, I've been clear that there is a job to be done here, and it's a job to be done because it's a job for delivering on the vote of the British people.
Mrs May said it was possible to get further clarification and more assurances from the European Union over the backstop in the coming weeks to try to win support for her Brexit deal in Parliament. However, the President of the EU Council, Donald Tusk, seemed to suggest there wasn't much, if any, wiggle room.
We are ready to reconfirm our assurances and our goodwill and good faith when it comes to so-called backstop. I have no mandate to organise any further negotiations. We have to exclude any kind of opening our negotiations on the withdrawal agreement.
Donald Tusk. Well, our Europe correspondent, Kevin Connolly, joins me now from Brussels. Kevin, we saw a rather worried or perhaps even angry-looking Mrs May talking to Jean-Claude Juncker ahead of one session. She later said that he'd explained that when he used the term nebulous, he was talking about the debate in Britain and not Mrs May herself. But that did seem rather suggestive of two leaders talking at cross purposes, didn't it?
I'm not sure I'd read that much into it, Caroline. I think what happened this morning was pretty colourful stuff by our standards, I should say, is that we always get a mute few minutes of video footage of the leaders gathering in the conference room. They're always clapping each other on the back, gathering into groups, all the rest of it. Well, today, rather uncharacteristically, Theresa May came stalking into that room, clearly looking for Jean-Claude Juncker, very quickly found him and had an obviously confrontational conversation with him. Well, she was picking him up on his use of the word nebulous last night. He'd said the British position was nebulous and imprecise. And she came over to him, and lip readers say that she said, "Did you call me nebulous?" And Mr Juncker looked a little bit sheepish, a little bit as though he'd been caught out. So that issue then went away for a little while, but later in the day, when Mr Juncker met reporters, he tried to explain himself. He said he didn't realise the French word nebuleux had an English equivalent, nebulous, and that it meant foggy or cloudy. So I think we can have a listen to Jean-Claude Juncker now, explaining himself and suggesting that when it was all over, they were all friends again.
I did not refer to her, but to the overall state of the debate in Britain. I was following the debate in the House, and I can't see where the British Parliament is heading at. And that's why I was saying that this was nebulous, foggy in English, so it was not, I was not addressing her. And in the course of the morning, after having checked what I said yesterday night, she was kissing me.
So has Donald Tusk offered any solace to Theresa May?
It was quite interesting, Donald Tusk. I mean, obviously, everyone here, as Jean-Claude Juncker told you there, everyone here is watching events at Westminster. They're all aware of the parliamentary arithmetic. They're all aware of the atmosphere. And Donald Tusk was a little bit stung, I think, when people were asking here about whether Theresa May had been snubbed last night, whether she'd been given a hard time at that meeting of all those other European leaders. And Donald Tusk said she certainly hadn't. There were lots of warm words of admiration for Mrs May's, whatever you would call it, stick-at-it ability, I suppose, her durability in these tough circumstances. So warm words, and Donald Tusk actually went as far as to compare the way she's been treated here in Brussels with the way she's treated at Westminster, a pretty forceful way, I think, of making his point and showing you that they are listening to what happens in London.
And yet none of that seemed to move Europe very much in terms of offering any concessions.
I think that's right. Theresa May gave a very fighting defence of what had been agreed here, which is emphasis on the fact that the celebrated Irish border backstop is a temporary arrangement and there's an ambition to replace it as quickly as possible with a trade agreement. So you did get those words, much warmer words we think had been prepared and did not end up in that final document. And I think the reason for that, Caroline, is very simple. Everyone here feels that Theresa May is already behind this agreement. She signed it after all. So everyone knows then that the game when you try to get concessions is not to appease her, but to please people back at Westminster. And there's a genuine question here about whether the Eurosceptic critics of the deal back at Westminster would be persuaded by anything that the EU27 might offer. So I think we can expect more movement next month, but that's why there was less movement than we thought this time around.
Kevin, thank you. Well, with little change to offer MPs, Theresa May faces the prospect of parliamentary gridlock when she returns to Westminster. So what options does she have? The Conservative MP for Gloucester, Richard Graham, has experience in negotiating settlements. He was a diplomat before turning to politics. I asked him whether it was time for a plan B to emerge.
If the government's deal can't attract enough support from Conservative MPs, then you have to look for a deal which will command support from both sides of the House. And it really has to be a Labour and Conservative deal. I mean, I've had talks with Labour colleagues which suggest to me that actually they can live with pretty well everything in the withdrawal agreement. They would probably require some additional changes, possibly around safeguarding workers' rights and so on, that they would probably like to be a bit stronger. But I don't see it as impossible to find agreement around what's been proposed, but with a slightly different future direction. I mean, it may look more like an EEA and EFTA thing, what the media would call Norway plus plus.
What is life like for those like you within the Conservative Party in Parliament who do support Mrs May's deal? Will you be out there trying to change minds before the Christmas recess, or is there really a civil war over Europe that's coming to a head?
It will take a bit of time. That's why I think bringing it to Parliament in the new year is the sensible thing to do. So I think at this stage, my advice to all colleagues is to just think really not about what they as individuals don't like in the existing agreement, but what they think are the likely alternatives. And if you look at successful negotiations in the past where people have had to make compromises, for example, the Dayton Agreement over the former Yugoslavia, that had to succeed when all the parties who were fighting came to the conclusion that actually this was the least worst option, that if they carried on fighting, they might end up in an even worse situation. And there's an element of that, I think, in the debate over the agreement in Europe. When you start looking in detail at Norway plus plus, EEA and EFTA, actually they're not as good as the deal that's currently being offered. And that's the bit of the equation that I think hasn't had enough thinking yet.
Conservative MP Richard Graham. So what options are available to Theresa May now? Our political correspondent Chris Mason is in Westminster. Chris, how much more appealing will Theresa May's deal be to MPs next week?
I think it tells you everything you need to know when you listen to the conversation you've just had there with Conservative MP Richard Graham, and he is comparing the situation in Parliament with the Balkan War, the scale of disagreement that exists both within the Conservative Party and beyond it. In terms of the reaction to this summit, Conservative MPs who are Brexiteers are and will conclude that she's coming back with the square root of diddly squat, and the Prime Minister has to go back before the Commons on Monday, as is traditional after a European summit. I've been doing some sums this afternoon, Caroline, and in the last month, the Prime Minister has spent 11 hours and 58 minutes defending her withdrawal agreement, and that doesn't even include Prime Minister's questions on the floor of the Commons. She'll do it again on Monday afternoon, and then have to hope, because it's her only hope, that something, as Kevin was touching on a few minutes ago, emerges in January. But as things stand, it doesn't look that could possibly be big enough to persuade enough minds for her to be able to get this through, even though there is a will in the Commons to try and secure some sort of deal, because there's widespread opposition to no deal at all. So
what are Theresa May's options now? I mean, is there a plan B?
I think the options are that, well, firstly, she's still in a job. I mean, and that's worth reflecting on at the end of the week that we've just had. She is still there. She still has options that she can pursue other than returning to her constituency and no longer being Prime Minister. So in the new year, I think clearly she's going to have to try and extract something, anything, from the European Union. As things stand, it doesn't seem that can add up to a sufficient thing to persuade enough people. And there's a recurrence here of what we had when David Cameron had his doomed renegotiation with the EU before the referendum, that there can be vastly different perceptions of the scale of what's been achieved. What Brussels might see as a lion, some back at home will see as a mouse. And as things stand, it doesn't look like she's going to get enough to persuade people. So then you get the meaningful vote in the middle of next month, and as things stand, it looks like that would be lost. Parliament might by that stage have made it very clear that it wouldn't wear no deal. So you're in a situation where no deal has been rejected, the deal has been rejected, and so you get, and you're getting this already, competing arguments from those who have alternative visions for Brexit. Is that a Brexit modelled on the Norway approach of being in a customs union and a single market, Norway plus as it's described? Is it a looser Canada arrangement? Do you get pressure, which is already mounting, for another referendum articulated by Tony Blair on the Today programme this morning, and yet Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, isn't budging on his opposition to that. So you have that platter of options with those within and beyond the cabinet already wargaming through. Is there a majority for any of those things? And assembling a majority for anything on the positive at the moment, i.e. endorsing something rather than rejecting it in the House of Commons, hung as it is, at the moment looks mighty difficult.
Very briefly, Chris, I mean, are we likely to see an all-out civil war now, a blue-on-blue in Parliament?
I think it's underway already. David Dimbleby's valedictory question time last night, to his immediate right was a Conservative MP and to his immediate left was a Conservative MP. You wonder how many times in his 25 years in the helm that kind of thing was editorially justified. It absolutely was last night, because the gaps between the two Tory MPs were vast. The crevasses that exist are there for all to see and will continue to play out throughout Christmas, New Year and well into next year. One Cabinet Minister the other day, I exchanged seasonal greetings with him. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. There was a wry smile when I used the word happy.
Chris, thank you. At almost 5:20, Zeb's here with the headlines.
Theresa May says it's still possible to gain assurances from the EU about her Brexit deal, even though European leaders say the ball is now in the British court. Donald Trump's former lawyer Michael Cohen says the president knew it was wrong to order a payment to two women who claimed they'd had an affair with him. Facebook says a bug may have meant that private photos of up to 7 million users could be accessed by other companies.
Zeb, thank you. The British round-the-world sailor Susie Goodall has been reunited with her family after spending more than 5 months at sea. The 29-year-old was knocked unconscious during a storm in the Southern Ocean, which capsized her yacht and destroyed its mast while she competed in a solo round-the-world race. After being rescued by a cargo ship, she arrived in Chile's Punta Arenas this morning. Carlos Serra Espillo is in charge of the port.
She is in a shock. Now we're in a hospital for medical assistance. After that, we're going to send a letter of appreciation to the captain of the vessel for this great experience of search and rescue operation.
Tracy Edwards skippered a crew in a round-the-world race when her mast broke just off the coast of Chile 20 years ago, and she joins us now. Tracy, what's it like to step back onto dry land after something like that happens to you?
It's a very strange experience. You go through a real range of emotions. When you're at sea, you are totally focused on survival and you're very inward looking, if you like, and you are just looking at yourself, the ocean and getting to shore. And of course, when you get to shore, you want to be ashore because you know that means you're alive, but you're gutted because you don't really want to be ashore because you want to be out in the ocean. It's also the moment when you realise that you haven't achieved your goal, that Susie now realises that, and I know you know that when you're at sea, but it really hits you when you reach land. You know, with finality, my dream is over. 4 years or 3 years of hard work is over, and that's very emotional.
And what kept you going during that phase?
I think knowing that and this is why I think Susie is just quite an extraordinary young lady, having met her before she left and thinking she was amazing then. I mean, my focus was my crew. So I put my fears aside and my worries because I knew I had to make sure that they were okay. I think being on your own, I can't imagine quite the experience, but, just that hanging on, keeping focused on getting to shore and I think probably keeping loved ones in mind.
And do you think she will be back on the water again soon, or does it take a while to recover from something like this?
Well, as we were sailing the 16 miles to Chile with our jury rig and our various cut-up sails that we managed to put together, we were all saying, right, that's it. I'm never going to sea again. Never. That's no more. And the second we were back, we all looked at each other and went, we've got to do this again, don't you? And we've got to get back out there. It passes very quickly.
And do you have any advice for her when she returns home? What to do?
I think that's a really interesting one and something that we weren't prepared for. When you're at sea, you are only responsible for yourself. But what is a strange experience is when you reach dry land, you suddenly have to take into account that everyone has been really worried about you and scared for you, and you almost end up having to comfort them, which is something that is quite difficult to get used to. So for the moment, I'm seeing it from the other point of view. I'm on dry land. I've also got a crew out there. We rescued my old boat Maiden, and she's out sailing around the world with a younger, fitter, all-female crew. And when they're out there, I know they're fine, but I am permanently terrified and worried, and it's them reassuring me, we're fine. And I think that's quite hard, and she'll find she's doing quite a lot of that.
Tracy Edwards, thank you for joining us. It's the beginning of the end of an era on the Magnificent Seven today. And some small cheer for motorists, at least if you travel to Wales via the Seven Bridges. There might be a few traffic jams there for commuters this evening, but that's because work has started on demolishing the M4 toll booths on the bridge, as it goes toll-free this coming Monday. Vehicles have had to pay to cross between South West England and South Wales since the first bridge was opened by the Queen in 1966, and excited motorists queued to cross it. We thought we'd play you some archive of the day. Here's Wales Today's Brian Huey talking to some of those waiting to travel over the Severn Bridge for the first time.
Good morning, and it really is good morning because it's just about 10 minutes to 7, and in 5 minutes the barriers will go up for the opening officially of the Severn Bridge to the public. It's just like the start of Brands Hatch or Silverstone here, with over 40 vehicles ready to make the dash to be the first across. I'm going to speak to some of the drivers who've been waiting here for some considerable time now, and the first person I'm going to speak to is Mr. Barry Cheshire, who comes from Cardiff. Mr. Cheshire, how long have you been waiting?
Well, by the time the vehicles start up, it should be 87 hours from Tuesday evening.
How have you managed to pass the time away here? You must have been bored stiff.
Well, not really. I brought plenty of my own entertainment with me. Books, magazines, I had the wireless, and plenty of food and to drink.
How have you managed about having a wash and a shave and things like this?
Brought a gallon of water in the back, which I've had to shave in cold water, admittedly, but it's been a bit uncomfortable, but I think it's been worthwhile in the end.
I believe I've been lucky enough to find the newlyweds. Could I ask you your name?
Robert Goldsmith.
You are the honeymoon couple?
Yes.
Well, we can't see Mrs. Goldsmith. Would you like to come out and let's have a look at you, Mrs. Goldsmith? I've heard of some very unusual ways of spending a honeymoon, but I've never heard of anybody spending it sitting in the back of a car waiting to cross a newly opened bridge. Why have you done this?
Well, we've on our way home from our honeymoon, actually, and as we were local near this place, we thought we'd try and be the first honeymoon couple to cross it, you know.
Mrs. Goldsmith, where do you come from?
Oh, well, I come from Wanstead.
You're going back to London now,
yes,
in fact, have you?
Yes.
Why do you particularly want to cross the bridge?
Just My husband wanted to.
How long have you been waiting here?
About last night.
8 o'clock, 9 o'clock last night, I suppose.
How did you spend the evening, if it's not an embarrassing question?
I was in the back and he was in the front.
I was in the front, you know, and you can see the...
I was in the front.
What a marvellous honeymoon. The Welsh Government estimates the abolition of the charges will benefit the Welsh economy by about £100 million a year, while daily users of the crossings could save, well, over £1,000 a year once the toll is removed. For some in Wales, it really does feel like the end of an era, as it does for Ruth Jones, whom you might remember as Nessa in the sitcom Gavin and Stacey.
When I was little, long car journeys from Porthcawl, where I lived, into England were not that frequent, but they brought with them the usual delights of I Spy and car bingo and the all-time family favourite, who will be the first to see the Severn Bridge. Now, the main reason me and my brothers and sister got excited about this first viewing was that it meant you got to win... You got to win 5 pence, which was almost half the cost of the Severn Bridge toll back then, so not to be sniffed at. Of course, that Severn Bridge was the original one at Aust, opened the year I was born, a much smaller bridge and further up the river. And in those days, you had to pay both to leave Wales and to come back in again. I think 12.5p was the earliest toll that I can remember. Anyway, eventually we got a big new shiny bridge where you only had to pay once, and that was to enter the land of my fathers, not leave it. And by now I was driving my own car and moaning about the extortionate toll at every crossing, because I was filled with this overwhelming resentment that I had to pay to re-enter Wales. And yes, I probably did show my annoyance on more than one occasion. I do remember being told off once and my change being withheld by the toll man until I said a proper thank you. But it was a pain, let's be fair. There was always that panic about finding enough cash for the toll, scrabbling around on my cold Fiesta carpet for the final 50 pence to make up the £4.50 or whatever it cost back then. I think they even made a feature of this in a scene from a show called Gavin and Stacey, where a character called Smithy was desperate to cross the bridge to make it to the birth of his first child. Short of the final 10p and faced with a jobsworthy toll collector, Smithy and his mate Gavin decide to jump that Severn Bridge barrier and literally gate crash their way into Wales.
Hi, sorry, we've only got £5, but his girlfriend is just about to have a baby, so...
Sorry, sir, I cannot allow you into the country without payment of the appropriate fee. This has been clearly advertised on your approach to the bridge, £5 and 10 pence only.
Only? Are you taking the piss?
Can I draw your attention to the sign on your right, which clearly states offensive behaviour towards tolling staff will not be tolerated and will lead to prosecution?
It's 10p. She's in labour. Are you honestly going to make him miss the birth of his first child for
you
the sake
do not
of 10p?
have the appropriate funds.
Are you serious?
I will have to ask
I'm
you to
about
put your
to have
car
a
into
baby.
reverse.
Of course, in recent times, they've made it much easier to pay. Credit cards, contactless, even the mysterious tag, whatever that is. All I know is that if you've got one, the barriers magically seem to rise of their own free will when you approach. But who cares? Because come December the 17th, that's all going to go, and no longer will the thought of paying a hefty toll mar the magnificent journey, whatever the weather, across that vast and beautiful estuary, with the Little Brother or Big Sister Bridge, downstream or upstream, depending on your route. Here's to freedom of movement, of sorts, across the River Severn, at least.
Ruth Jones reflecting on the soon-to-be good old days of tolls on the Severn Bridge. Let's find out where Jonathan Dimbleby is.
Caroline, hello. I've had a very easy journey and I'm now in a brasserie sheltering from the cold in the fine cathedral city of Chichester, only too aware that this is Groundhog Friday. After enduring a week in which the Palace of Westminster distinguished itself with a display of malice and mendacity that bears comparison with the murderous enmities of the ancient Roman Senate, the Prime Minister faced humiliation in Brussels, where the EU have made it very clear, unequivocally so it sounds, that there can be no legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement so comprehensively rejected in Parliament. So, perhaps our four panellists will be asked to tease out the implications of this rebuff, the pros and cons of the alternative ways ahead. Hilary Benn, Labour Chair of the Brexit Select Committee, Sir Vince Cable, Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Home Office Minister and May loyalist Caroline Noakes, and leading Leave Means Leave campaigner who has no confidence in his party leader, Peter Bone. Clarity, illumination, straight answers to straight questions. We love it, don't we, Caroline? We can but hope. 8 o'clock this evening.
We do. Jonathan, thank you. It's just after 5:30 and Zeb Soanes has the headlines.
Theresa May has left the European Union summit in Brussels, insisting that Britain will have more discussions with the EU in coming days, as she seeks further assurances on her Brexit proposals, which might placate her backbenchers. She said she'd had a robust discussion with the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, who used a news conference to deny suggestions that he'd called her nebulous. It's emerged that British people will have to buy a permit costing £6.30 to travel to EU countries after Brexit. The European Commission says travellers from the UK won't need a visa, but will have to apply for an online document called an ETIAS from 2021. A UN-brokered ceasefire between the warring parties in Yemen appears to be holding in the country's main port, Hodeidah. The agreement marks the first major breakthrough in 5 years of failed peace talks. Aid workers hope to deliver supplies to millions of starving people. President Trump's former lawyer Michael Cohen says Mr. Trump knew it was wrong to order the payment of hush money to 2 women who'd claimed they'd had affairs with him. In a TV interview, Cohen, who's been sentenced to 3 years in jail, said Donald Trump was worried the allegations would become public during the presidential election. Mr. Trump has said he never directed his former attorney to break the law. Kurdish forces backed by American airstrikes have driven the remaining Islamic State fighters out of the town of Hajin, one of their last strongholds in Syria. It follows weeks of intense fighting. A fourth person has died of injuries sustained in Tuesday's shooting at a Christmas market in France. The attacker, Sharif Shakat, was himself shot dead by police last night. The market in Strasbourg has reopened with tight security in place. Bin workers in Birmingham have voted overwhelmingly to take industrial action in a new row about pay. The Unite union said members would initially stop short of a full strike, but would work to rule from December the 29th. On the currency and stock markets in London, the 100 share index closed down 32 points at 6,845. A short while ago in New York, the Dow Jones was down 442 points at 24,155. Against the dollar, the pound is trading at $1.25.7, and against the euro, it's unchanged at €1.11.2. That makes the euro worth nearly 90 pence.
Seb, thank you. Well, if you've been trying to escape Brexit with a trip to the sunshine somewhere, lucky you. In future years after Brexit, most British travellers will have to pay €7 or around £6 for a 3-year pre-travel authorisation to visit the EU. And if you have been travelling abroad recently, you might have noticed that the pound in your pocket seems to buy rather fewer dollars or euros than it used to. So what is going on with the British currency? Professor Linda Yu is the author of The Great Economist, and she's in our Oxford studio. Linda, how significant is the rate of exchange between the pound and the dollar, and what does it mean for the economy?
It certainly has a lot of impact in terms of what we all can buy if you travel abroad, or even if you were to buy something produced in the United States. So certainly the currency matters a great deal for consumers. And I think what we have seen is with Brexit, there's been a lot of volatility, meaning sterling has moved a great deal, particularly against the United States dollar. And what that also means for British businesses is that there is a greater range that when they think about production or sourcing inputs, they need to take into account the fact that sterling a few months ago was trading at £1 would have gotten you over $1.40, and now today, as we heard, would only get you $1.25. So that just adds to, I think, volatility around business planning, and I think for all those reasons it is very important to try and stabilize the currency. But I think as sterling is moving on Brexit news, that is going to be a little bit unlikely in the coming months.
Yes, I mean, how can a government or a country counter that sort of uncertainty that Brexit is bringing to the value of the pound?
Well, certainly, sterling has been almost a reflection of the worries of investors, and maybe also by extension businesses, around what will happen with Brexit. So the reason why sterling was trading a little bit stronger against the dollar just earlier this year is that it seemed as if there was a withdrawal agreement. Of course, that's the reason for sterling falling very sharply against the dollar this week. That withdrawal agreement would have given some certainty as to how businesses ought to be trading over the next couple of years. And with the withdrawal agreement being withdrawn this week and all of the news around Brexit, I think this is causing investors to lose a bit of confidence in the process. And if the withdrawal agreement, the government is going to bring that back before January 21st, if that passes, then remember that means we will know what our trading relationship with the EU is until the end of 2020 and potentially further. And I think that will help stabilize the value of sterling. But it's just also worth pointing out that, of course, for a large economy like the UK economy, having a currency which is moving isn't, so long as you're able to hedge, which is what businesses do. They try to take positions to make sure that it doesn't really affect them too much. It's not a terribly worrying thing. So I think what it really shows is an underlying concern about where Brexit is headed. So if the withdrawal agreement is passed, or some other type of agreement, so that we know where we're headed over the next couple of years, that will help to stabilize the currency a bit.
And briefly, Linda, what about the euro? What's been happening to it?
So the euro has also not had a great day, and it's been a few issues around, especially weak economic data coming out of France. As you know, the the protests around the fuel surcharge, that's caused quite a lot of concerns around the stability of the French economic reforms, and that goes to its growth. So euro is also, I think, trading a bit on that. And the big change for the euro is the European Central Bank. Its central bank has decided they're not going to continue to inject cash anymore past the end of this year. So that is playing into the euro as well. And that's the final thing to say about when we look at sterling. It's always traded against some other currency. So our value depends on what happens with America. If rates go up, which they're likely to, that means we'll be weaker against the dollar. If the euro weakens, we can get a little bit more for our money. So I'm not suggesting this is a holiday strategy, but you may want to take a look at destinations where sterling takes you a bit further because their currencies are weakening for other reasons.
Professor Yeo, thank you for joining us. Well, after a tumultuous week of political backstabbing, front-stabbing and sidestepping on Brexit, we're no clearer. How did we get here? Mark Mardell has been taking a stroll through recent history in his series Brexit, a Love Story. Today, how and when were assurances made about whether or not Britain would stay in the customs union?
We seek a new and equal partnership between an independent, self-governing global Britain and our friends and allies in the EU.
It was a big speech. It had its place, Lancaster House.
This is a great place from which people love to grandstand. You know, it is a magnificent showcase.
We looked at a number of venues, but actually Lancaster House was politically neutral, but still delivered the same kind of narrative and framing that we wanted.
Not partial membership of the European Union, associate membership of the European Union, or anything that leaves us half in, half out.
And it had its purpose.
She did take the view that this was one speech which would be the first of probably many, and of course that it should communicate to our European partners that actually Brexit was going to happen.
It even provoked pleasure.
I think that the Lancaster House speech was probably the best speech I've heard the Prime Minister make.
By this I do not mean that we will seek some form of unlimited transitional status in which we find ourselves stuck forever in some kind of permanent political purgatory. That would not be good for Britain.
Remember when permanent political purgatory was merely a prospect? Those far-off halcyon days when Mrs May could please her party? The days of Lancaster House? I'm Mark Mardell, and this is Brexit, a Love Story, The Long Divorce. We've taken a hard look at the turbulent 45-year relationship leading up to this point. Now we bring our story up to date. We'd promised you the inside story of Dexu this week, but like Keynes, when the facts change, we change our mind, and we're bringing forward our long look at Lancaster House and the Customs Union, because it might shed more light on how we got to where we are today. Mrs May had delighted her party conference with a hardline speech. Now her cabinet had to struggle to catch up and define what it meant, and the economic implications of the Great Escape, how to end half a century of entanglement without tearing ourselves apart. Remember that question mark from last time? A love story? In this episode there are some answers, wrapped not in ribbon but red lines, inside Lancaster House.
The Prime Minister prepares to give a major speech on the government.
Will set out her approach to Brexit in a speech this morning.
Theresa May will make a speech, easily the most important of her premiership thus far, in which...
January 2017, and the plan was for a big Brexit speech in Canary Wharf. But Number 10's Director of Strategy, Chris Wilkins, remembers it wasn't quite ready. He should know. He was the one writing it.
The first draft of it was produced over that Christmas period. And then when we came back and met in the first week after the New Year, after Christmas, we looked at that draft and we felt at that point that it still needed some more work and a bit more framing. So at that point we decided to sort of pull what would have been the Canary Wharf speech and turn it into the Lancaster House speech, which was delivered a couple of weeks later.
The words are one thing, but what about the message sent by the choice of backdrop?
Well, what you see is this magnificent building that was built between 1825 and about 1841.
James York is author of Lancaster House, London's greatest townhouse.
It's a very imposing classical building with a great portico and Corinthian columns on the first floor. It is clad in Bath stone, very much...
This grand historic building had been used for years to wow and woo foreign dignitaries. Mrs May used its grandeur as the background to a speech designed to delight Brexit enthusiasts.
And this was originally built for the Grand Old Duke of York. In a way, it's not inappropriate if you bear in mind that the Grand Old Duke of York was the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army.
Do you know why the Grand Old Duke of York marched them up to the top of the hill, where that came from?
I was told by somebody that he owned a property in Yorkshire, but I think what it was, there was a hill where he rather enjoyed parading people up and down. That's a story that I have heard, and for all I know, it may be absolute rubbish, but it's like all good stories, you can always repeat them.
While I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain.
Many Brexiteers felt it was downhill from then. They'd say this was Mrs May's red period, a vision of Brexit painted in bold, thick lines, which over time would turn pallid pink and distinctly wavy.
Because we would still be able to trade with Europe. We would still be free to strike trade deals across the world, and we would have the freedom to set the competitive tax rates and embrace the policies that would attract the world's best companies and biggest investors to Britain.
But it took months for Mrs May's government to get here and decide what Brexit might mean. Chris Brannigan was Mrs May's Director of Government Relations, and he remembers the optimism he saw on his first day in the job. There was a special cabinet meeting at Chequers.
I have to say that everyone was, it was a lovely day. You know, sun was coming through the windows. Chequers is a beautiful setting. It sits around and everyone stops and has this remarkably ambitious and not quite idealistic plan, but it hasn't been mired in the reality of the politics.
But that sunny optimism wasn't solid enough for bankers and business people. Nissan wanted and got reassurances. We still don't know what they were, but former Cabinet Minister Nicky Morgan was worried by the general atmosphere.
There were promises being made and a tone about the parliamentary party was being set. The business voice was being absolutely ignored, and I think businesses would say they found it very difficult to get into number 10 or make their voices heard anywhere outside the Treasury.
Even when they were heard, Mrs May didn't always have an answer.
One of the chief executives from one of the main US banks had said to the Prime Minister that, you know, it takes 2 years to get a French banking licence. What I can't do is run the risk of competitive disadvantage by not knowing what I'm going to go and do now. Can you give me the clarity? Can you tell me in that very New Yorky way? Can you tell me what's going on? But she couldn't give the detail.
It took some months for the Cabinet to realise the way ahead was neither obvious nor straightforward. In her conference speech, Mrs May had implied leaving both the single market and the customs union, but without spelling it out. The permanent secretary at the Department for International Trade at this time was Sir Martin Donnelly.
I think a lot of people were beginning to understand the complexities of the process, that leaving the European Union is not like walking through a door. It's more like finding yourself in a swamp without many paths. And people were trying to understand what the consequences of, for example, not being in a customs union were going to be in terms of trade and rules of origin and the difference between goods and services.
The customs union and the single market were the battlegrounds. Should we cleave as close as possible to structures which had become a part of the very fabric of our economy? Or was the obvious logic of leaving the European Union rejecting those economic projects which come with so many rules and restrictions attached? Battle lines shift over time, wet and dry, left and right, leave and remain, replaced now by hard and soft Brexit. But those labels underplay the defining differences in priorities, those who put first what they saw as the economic reality, and those for whom the political priority of leaving the EU trumped gloomy predictions. Economic departments, like Trade and Industry, commissioned helpful surveys. One showed leaving the customs union would cost the British economy 4.5%. In private, the Cabinet circled around the critical question. In public, they prevaricated. The Chancellor tried to dodge the question at the Treasury Select Committee.
Are we leaving the customs union? The government, as you said, is reviewing, gathering evidence,
considering arguments around the appropriate negotiating stance for the forthcoming negotiations with the European Union, both on leaving the Union and on our future relationship with the Union.
So did the City Minister, Simon Kirby.
Have you ruled out a single market as an option, access to the single market as an option? A yes-no answer would be fine.
We're definitely leaving the EU, OK? But we don't rule anything in and we don't rule anything out.
OK.
And so did enthusiastic Brexiteer International Trade Secretary Liam Fox.
You yourself are open to the possibility of staying inside the customs union, yes or no?
Well, I'll argue my case inside Cabinet rather than on the programme. Right. But one thing I think is...
I'm just interested, because you have always been so outspoken on this issue in the past.
And I remain instinctively a free trader, and that matters at the moment.
Cabinet ministers who leant further forward than the Prime Minister liked risked being slapped back down. Enter stage-right Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson in the Czech Republic. Interviewed by Martin Earl of the newspaper Haspraska Novny.
It was like 18 minutes at all. Out of these 18 minutes, 2 minutes were for the photographer. So we had 16 minutes. So we didn't have so much time to judge him according to the personality. And then was no kind of small talk.
No small talk, but a bold word.
It's bollocks. You can translate bollocks into Czech.
It was a really sensitive time, it was a half year after referendum, and we thought that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of any European country would be more or less careful what he or she is saying. But again, it's Boris Johnson, so finally we weren't surprised so much.
The interview set off a series of explosions, most obviously because of the fruity language.
We had a dispute later on with the British government because there is a message that we have misquoted him.
And the Foreign Secretary entered the fray about the key point of contention at the time, the customs union.
He said that most probably we will have to leave the customs union, but it's the question about which we are going to negotiate.
A British newspaper at the time wrote, pressed repeatedly on whether Johnson was right to say the UK would probably leave the customs union, May's official spokeswoman would only say the Foreign Secretary was correct, that no decision had yet been made.
Another possibility might be the picture gallery upstairs. That's the great where politicians love grandstanding, and where the Lancaster House Agreement was signed, and where, dare I say it, Theresa May made her Brexit speech. So I think when you see it, there'll be a certain feeling...
By the time it came to Lancaster House, the policy was clear. Or was it? Not for the first time, history was being made in a rather grand room, in a rather grand mansion.
What I am proposing cannot mean membership of the single market.
Historic? So far, history records this as a hard-line speech, but there was balance, not only migration, but money promised to the European Union, and a transition period asked for, no sudden shock for businesses.
I know my emphasis on striking trade agreements with countries outside Europe has led to questions about whether Britain seeks to remain a member of the EU's customs union. And it is true that full customs union membership prevents us from negotiating our own comprehensive trade deals. Now, I want Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade agreements, but I also want tariff-free trade with Europe and cross-border trade there to be as frictionless as possible. That means I do not want Britain to be part of the common commercial policy, and I do not want us to be bound by the common external tariff. These are the elements of the customs union that prevent us from striking our own comprehensive trade agreements with other countries. But I do want us to have a customs agreement with the EU.
I was actually sitting in the Prime Minister's study watching it with some colleagues, and it was fortunate at times that the television cameras didn't turn around the other way and capture some of the ambassadors sitting in the front row who, as I understand it, sat on their hands for virtually the entire speech.
No standing ovation from the ambassadors, and old Foreign Office hands like Lord Kerr were aghast. This was no way to carry out a negotiation.
I think it was a great pity that instead of saying, this is what we bring to the table, and here are some texts setting out how we think cooperation in future should work, and maybe these are struts to go in the framework for the future relationship required by the treaty. Instead of doing that, we set out red lines we said we are not prepared to be in the single market and the customs union. We want out of jurisdiction of the Court of Justice, and we want absolutely no requirement on freedom of movement. So we painted red lines under our feet.
But MPs who'd campaigned enthusiastically for Brexit liked what they heard. Over at the Department for Exiting the European Union, the Minister, David Jones, was delighted.
I think that the Lancaster House speech was probably the best speech I've heard the Prime Minister make. It was very well crafted and it was extremely well delivered. And the room at Lancaster House was full of ambassadors from across the world, but of course most particularly from the EU. And I remember as I left Lancaster House speaking to a number of the ambassadors who all said that it was a very impressive speech and that it delivered the clarity as to the British position which they hadn't previously had.
Those on the other side of the debate, like Nicky Morgan, weren't so happy.
I think this issue, and it always has been, of being able to do our own trade deals was the kind of thing that she held up and that the Brexiteers held up as this was the mark of a successful Brexit. Could we be in charge of our own trade policy? And that was clearly the direction of travel. Whereas I think a number of us just felt this is just not realistic, that actually Europe is a massively important trading bloc for our country and that it wasn't going to be as simple as just saying we're walking away from single market, customs union, everything else, and we're going to strike out on our own.
The man who wrote it, Chris Wilkins, is adamant this was the first bid in the negotiation, not final, firm red lines.
In any negotiation, you set out a negotiating position and then you move from there. You know, if you want to buy my house, you come to me and you say, I'll give you £200,000, and I say, I want £300,000. You don't at that point say, well, I'm sorry, you've hoisted yourself by your own red lines there. You use that as the basis to start talks. So I don't really buy into that language of red lines, and I think it was, as I say, more nuanced than people give it credit for.
If journalism day by day is the first draft of history, this is the second draft, full of crossings outs and scribblings in. We're trying to conduct a post-mortem while the patient is still on the operating table. And remember, some of our informants still have skin in a game which is being played out in front of our very eyes. Mrs May had turned prophet and warned of the danger of being stuck forever in some kind of permanent political purgatory. The doughty defenders of the British Army of old were known as the Thin Red Line. Many of those enthusiastic for Brexit saw her speech as a series of thick red lines, not to be breached by enemy action. Some in Europe, too, saw that as the intention. But those closest to Mrs May saw an opening gambit, full of wriggle room, not pinned in place with fixed bayonets at the barricades. Some would feel she marched them down from the top of the hill. Apparently, that was always her intention. To strengthen her hand, Mrs May was about to shuffle the cards. That would change her fortune. This cautious, careful woman took a gamble very few thought was a gamble at all, but left her fatally weakened. Next time, we're tracking the road to the election and Chequers. On Brexit, a love story, the long divorce. Back in the new year.
Mark Mardell, and if you're in need of more Brexit over the weekend, you can listen again to Brexit Love Story by subscribing on the BBC Sounds app. Now, the weather forecast with Nick Miller.
Hello. The weather's had a quiet week of it until now. It's about to turn much more active and hazardous for some parts of the UK as we go on through Saturday. Plenty of cold air in place. There's an approaching Atlantic weather system which tomorrow will bring rain and snow spreading east, but the greater concern is ice from freezing rain. There is a Met Office amber warning in force for ice, widespread ice, the result of freezing rain, and that's rain falling on frozen surfaces and turning things quickly like an ice rink, potentially in places of parts of the Midlands, more especially across northern England into Scotland for Saturday and then going on into the early hours of Sunday. So again, some potentially very hazardous weather on the way for these parts of the UK. Winds picking up elsewhere, rain as well. It's a real mess, particularly if you're travelling on Saturday. Tonight, it is outbreaks of rain pushing into parts of Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest England. And maybe again the risk of a bit of sleet and freezing rain towards eastern parts of Wales, but for most it'll be rain with increasing southerly winds. Elsewhere, clear spells and a widespread frost. Into tomorrow then, and for southwest England, Wales and Northern Ireland, it'll turn wetter during the day. The rain will turn heavier, more persistent. The winds pick up as well, 50 to 60 mile per hour gusts, 30 to 50 millimetres of rain is possible. For southeast England, expect increasing cloud, rain pushing east, particularly through the afternoon. Similar picture into eastern England, maybe a bit of light sleet or snow first of all, before it quickly turns to rain. Then for the Midlands, for northern England and Scotland, this is where we are going to see some rain, perhaps preceded by some sleet and snow. But again, the greater concern will be this freezing rain and potentially very hazardous ice here. So do be very aware that that's a possibility where you are. North of the central belt in Scotland, we're going to see a spell of snow and blizzards in the strengthening winds. Maybe that snow amassing to around 40 centimetres in the higher ground. A cold day for much of the UK, but for Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest England, temperatures just reaching into double figures in some spots here.
Nick, thank you. Well, Paddy O'Connell is here with us to tempt us with a look ahead to Sunday morning and Broadcasting House.
Caroline, thank you. Good evening, and hello, good evening to you. Well, there is the first hope for Yemen in 5 years, where millions stand on the brink of famine. We explore the history and the country on Sunday morning. It's the sort of news which Brexit occludes. On which subject, Simon Jenkins argues, we've had 7 days of sound and fury signifying absolutely nothing.
One of the packs tore itself apart and then roared with delight as Theresa May was confirmed as Tory leader. Westminster has spent a week in hysterics, and I don't believe it's made the slightest difference.
Rachel Johnson and Giles Brandreth will play Scrabble on its 70th anniversary, which falls on Sunday, and will welcome the Bake-Off Queen, Prue Leith, Politics Tsarina Beth Rigby, and Captain Hannah Graff with their news review.
Paddy, thank you. And that is all from us for today. Our PM studio director was Sarah Kimberley and our PM editor, Amanda Lewis.
BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Neil Sleet. Good evening.